The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in the podcast belong solely to the hosts and not the host's past, present, or future employers. Hello, welcome back. It's Brian, Mr. Betcher, Mr. Berlin for Breaking Down Security.
Hello.
Hey. Oh, man. It's been a very busy week. I don't know how it is for everybody else, but yeah, it's been... Really?
Yes.
What'd you do this week?
Other than worked.
Well, yeah. Well, mine was prepping for a conference, getting my wife to the doctor for some surgery, which she is recovering from nicely, and getting the cars washed and everything. So and then it's like we got a heat wave here in Seattle. It got up to 95 degrees today, or 35 C for those of you who are,
I had like slammed at work, like constantly. Yeah. I did a hacking cast with Wildwest Hacking Fest online thing, and then Jeremy and I did a trial run for feedback for our detection and defense tabletop training stuff.
Nice.
I did an interview from some lady in Romania.
Interview for who?
Festival. I don't remember. I think
was it a magazine?
Affiliated with Sands, either Sands or Black Hat. I don't know. I've had a couple interviews last week, and I can't remember which one she was.
All right. Yeah. Oh, and I did CSEC East, so that was an odd thing. We moved it a week because virtual summer camp. Did either one of Mr. Betcher or Ms. Berlin? Did you go to Hacker Summer Camp, DEF CON, Black Hat, anything like that?
No.
I spoke at Black Hat.
How'd that go?
It's all right.
It was definitely different, I'd imagine, and I know everybody's, missing the whole in-person thing. I can completely understand that. So it definitely wasn't the same.
Yeah, I'm not, I don't get much out of online cons.
Oh.
Like if I want to watch a video of somebody doing something, I'll just go do it when I have free time. I'm not going to schedule it.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not super big into it.
Okay. So what was the feedback you got from your Detect and Defend tabletop session?
Oh, a lot. We had a lot of feedback. So it's very hard with the format we were giving it to switch to remote.
Oh.
Because we're like, all right, well, we'll do it via Zoom and Slack because we already had Slack set up with a bunch of bots and like auto responses and stuff.
Right.
Then like the day before, we're like, you know what? This would probably be way better with Discord because you don't have to switch back and forth between two applications. And the bots there's a lot more that you can do with them. You can assign roles to people and you can't do that in Slack.
Right.
So that's one huge takeaway that we're definitely going to switch to is Discord, doing it remotely. But other than that, like it went pretty well.
Right.
We had almost 20 people on, and they gave a lot of really cool feedback. So
that's great. Yeah. I tend to watch, one of the things I've been doing when I'm going on walks or I'm at work, I'll watch YouTube channels of people playing Dungeons and Dragons, the 5e version role play. And since COVID, I watched one called High Rollers, and they were tabletop. They had a tower, and they were in a building, and they were all together. And then once the COVID thing happened, they all went remote. And you can definitely tell the interactions aren't the same. People stumble over each other's words and such. And, we do that regularly here, obviously. But it definitely is much more difficult when you're trying to, do actions and stuff there. So it'll be interesting to see how it'll continue.
Yeah, because ours is like you have a huge classroom environment, and at first you're teaching everybody, which is fine, but then you split them up into the fake companies, and they have to like talk to each other in a group, and we have to talk to them, and then we go back and forth between the groups, so it's very difficult to do.
Yeah, breakout. You're doing breakout rooms then, yeah?
Yeah, but doing it between the breakout rooms and Zoom and Slack and everything, it was just not super well organized. And I was a tad bit stressed because I hadn't fully tested my entire VM infrastructure because I didn't have time after moving it and resetting it back up because we had server problems.
Yeah.
And I kind of crashed it like 40 minutes before we were supposed to start.
Oops. Oops.
But I figured it all out. That's fine.
Oh, that's good. All right. All right. Mr. Betcher, how are you doing, sir? Just want to get a quick status from you. You doing all right?
Oh, just getting by. Work is normal or picking up, and then, getting the kids ready for school. I think they're ready to go back big time. They need to, because like my youngest, how they have something that hurts. And we ask them where it is. Oh, it's my knee. And
Right.
then about a couple hours later, it's not the knee anymore. It's the ankle. It's stuff like that going on.
Yeah.
They just are very, they need to do something besides stay home. Yeah.
Yeah. Sadly, Seattle area schools are going to be doing virtual for the near term, but yeah, hopefully we'll be able to get back into school and get everybody back to in a classroom or whatever. So our guest this week has been patiently waiting for us, and I'm going to ask him, Allan Friedman. It's Natural 20. Oh my God. It's awesome to see you, sir. Fantastic. I rolled a natural. Oh, I cannot believe I wasted that 20. I could have used that on my next session. Damn it all. God, that sucks. Anyway, well, Allan, it's still great to have you on the show. This is a long time in coming, and I say that a long time because this actually came about from a continuation of the Ripple 20 discussion that we had a couple of weeks ago with Shlomi Oberman about what it took to get, to disclose these vulnerabilities to this company and how they could potentially manage that in the future. And you had tweeted out, hey, you know what, y'all are talking about SBOM. And I was like, I don't know what that is. And then I got educated, I got schooled. So Allan, thank you for coming on the show. Could you tell people a little bit about yourself, what you do, how you're in information security, and we'll get started.
Sure. So I run cybersecurity initiatives at a tiny part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. My background has been for the past 15, coming up on 20 years, bouncing between tech and policy. So I'm not really good at either. I started off in crypto in the late 90s, got my PhD in applied economics and policy, and did some computational modeling for a little bit. And I like to joke that when you're mediocre at fields as diverse as economics and network theory and cryptography, when you're mediocre at that many things, you sort of gravitate to Washington, D.C. Right. So I was in think tank land, and I joined the government about 5 years ago. And a lot of the work that I do is we talk about a market failure in security, and I'm at the Department of Commerce. And so the vision is, how can the government help catalyze better market solutions? We know the solutions are going to come from industry. They're going to come from the research community. They're going to come from experts in academia. But sometimes the government has to play a very important role of sort of helping to crystallize the starting points and create those positive feedback loops.
Nice. Okay. And you said the Department of Commerce. What exactly does the NTIA do, National Telecommunications and Information Administration?
We're a tiny part. So the Department of Commerce, very large. For those of you who don't really follow different cabinet level agencies, you can think of the Commerce as sort of the business support unit of the American economy. So all the things that you need to help run your business, whether it's what's the weather going to be today, or how do I export to this country, or how heavy is a kilogram anyway? All of those things are run through the Department of Commerce. NTI is a small part. We focus on telecommunication information. So everything from, if you've ever seen those big maps of federal spectrum all sliced up into who gets to use it for what, that's right. What we do. We also help with things like the digital divide and privacy. And of course, cybersecurity is a large and increasingly important role to make sure that we can actually trust the digital ecosystem we all depend on.
Cool. Okay. I'm really, like I said, Natural 20, I was very happy to have you come on the show. It was kind of a race condition because we had talked about this. I was going to speak at a conference about IoT and supply chain security on a panel there. And I wanted to talk to you before then, but things happened and I was actually going to record the panel before then. Somebody was ill prepared. So I got to move it to tomorrow, which is great because now I can apply this discussion to tomorrow's discussion. So I've got to completely rewrite all my slides before tomorrow at 10 a.m. So it's only a 10-minute conversation that I'm briefing, but I need to figure out how to hit the high points for all of this because there's a lot going on. You gave a talk at B-Side San Francisco earlier this year before the lockdown, obviously, about software transparency. And you were also talking about the software bill of materials. Is there a difference between software transparency and software bill of materials?
So it's funny that you mentioned that. Software bill of materials, or SBOM, is not a new idea. Right, the idea of a bill of materials goes back over 50 years in the history of supply chain. You can't build a thing until you know the parts that you're building with. And people have been talking about using this for software in the research world back in the 90s. It was even proposed in regulation back in 2012, 2013. But it was met with such a hostile reaction from a couple of different quarters that when I started to want to say, hey, let's open this conversation again, I had to find a new way of talking about it. So I said, well, let's talk about software component transparency. Because how could you be against transparency? Right? It's a very so, but really, the goal is to say we should know what we have. Right? We have lists of ingredients for a Twinkie. Why don't we know as much about what's in our critical infrastructure or what are the devices in our homes? And the means to an end of getting that transparency is the idea of an SBOM.
Okay. All right. So to add on to that, I said, I asked, why do we need one? And is it just poor communication between the vendors that are causing us to need them? Is this, would an SBOM not be needed if companies just shared everything that was in their cookie mix, for instance, between other companies? Or is that actually the problem where they don't want to share what's in their cookie mix?
I think when we think about what transparency is, we know that there isn't going to be a single one-size-fits-all, right? So let's use that list of ingredients analogy. People often conflate the list of ingredients, which is just, here's what's in it. So that way, if you have an allergy or food sensitivity, you know. And that, for me, is the minimum risk-based approach. Maybe you don't care what's in a Twinkie. You just need something to eat when you're hungover. But turns out Twinkies have beef tallow in them. And we all know people who have either an allergy or a food dietary restriction. So helping them make the risk-based decision. That's different than the nutrition label. The nutrition label is a set of concrete metrics that we have certain standards around, and that gets a little tricky. And then we have the recipe, which is getting very far into intellectual property. And we don't really expect, except in very certain circumstances, people who make things that tell us the recipe if they're not ready to. And so it's important to draw a distinction about what kind of transparency we're looking for. And our approach right now is to say what we want to do is create an expectation of transparency for literally the entire software world, which means we need to understand the different needs of everything from, a modern CI/CD Java shop to an ICS vendor that's dealing with very sensitive technology and everything in between. And we think the starting point is just say, you know what, if you're using a third-party dependency, you should tell your customer that because they should know what you're using. And that is the benefits of, one, informing them if there is a potential vulnerability or if there's in fact an actual vulnerability for shipping a vulnerability. But having that expectation of transparency drives better market behavior upstream. Because this is something that we don't have today, is the ability to push attention to our supply chain further upstream, the same way that we have in other areas for things like conflict minerals and things like that. We want to get that visibility so we can start to say, hey, you're using this open source library. That open source library only has 2 developers. What's the stability of this? Or, hey, maybe they're going to turn off support for this key feature that's part of my product. So really driving attention to thinking about the quality and concern of the supply chain.
Okay. Feel free to ask questions, folks. I'm trying.
Gesturing it.
No, please feel free to ask questions.
So thanks, Brian, for the
No problem. No problem.
subtle nod. Do your job. Yeah. So, at what point do you think that kind of stuff should be introduced to like different vendors? Like, if they don't have one, whose responsibility is it to ask? I mean, sometimes they have one internally. I'm assuming they just don't release it to their customers.
So this is a surprisingly both important idea, popular idea, but also something that more companies are realizing just how far they are from today. So there was a conference called FIRST, the Forum on Incident Response Security Teams, and 2 years ago, or last summer when it was in Edinburgh, there was not 1, not 2, but 3 global tech companies that gave talks from their product security team saying, this is all the work we have to do to get a view across our different product families of the software that we're using in our builds, because they didn't have that visibility today. These are global names. I talked to one global Fortune 200-ish company in the ICS space, and their director of product security has said, if we had this, we think we could save thousands of person hours every year, just because whenever a vulnerability is announced, these companies have to do a lot of work internally. Even the ones that are acting in good faith today that want to protect their customers still have to do this work today. So this is stuff that really sophisticated organizations have, but there really aren't too many of those that have this, especially when it comes for them to reach back up their supply chain. They can say, well, we know what products we use, but what are their internal dependencies, and so on. And so that's the vision here, is we don't do this today for a number of reasons, but perhaps first and foremost is there isn't a globally accepted vision of what this should look like, so it becomes really hard to ask for it. And that's really the work we're trying to do at NTIA, is to bring together the entire community, starting with the open source community. We've got active participation from Linux Foundation, Apache Foundation, Oasis, OWASP, and then working our way down the software supply chain all the way to the customers, enterprise customers, to say, well, what is the information that you need? And then from there saying, well, how can we make this a reality? Because what we don't want to do is create a situation where you've got one supplier who has to meet the needs of 100 different customers that are all asking for something different, or one customer that's getting different types of information from each of their suppliers. So we wanted to create this sort of shared vision, so that, and more we are hearing that customers are asking, hey, can you give me an SBOM? So we're starting to see this in the marketplace, and frankly, while NTIA is a non-regulatory agency, we think this can be done voluntarily. We know that regulators are also waiting in the wings, not just in the US, but around the world.
I remember even, gosh, okay, it's been a while now, but working in hospital, we would, vendors would come in and try and sell, like the radiology department, a piece of software or a piece of equipment or whatever. And it would be hard enough to even get them to tell us what version of Java it required.
Wow.
Yeah,
or,
it's kind of crazy that we don't have
process to move off of that or not require something. And it was always a struggle from that end, I know.
When WannaCry was racing across the internet, I heard the story of a hospital security chief, and this was, right, most hospitals don't have a large security team. If they have any security team, this one, fairly mature, had a security team, had to pull the entire team off the line to call up a bunch of medical device manufacturers to say, hey, does this blinking box that's keeping grandma alive, does it run Windows or Linux? Because he didn't have that availability, and he wasn't about to do a live scan on an operational network. And the kicker was one vendor gave the wrong answer. Said, don't worry, runs Linux. It ran Windows. It was vulnerable to Eternal Blue, and it was unpatchable the way it was configured. So, right, that's the kind of information that we need to start to push into the hands of customers so that they can make these better risk-based decisions.
Mr. Petcher?
I don't understand what the incentive is for a content creator on this, because a closed source, they're not going to want to disclose what's in their product because that brings more questions. And an open source product, they're just going to say, well, it's open source, go look for yourself. Well, what do you want us to provide you with an index or something? So, and then customers are probably just looking for the cheapest option. So what is the incentive for the vendors, for the programmers, the companies that create the content to do this if there's not a demand for it on the buyer side?
I love where you're thinking, because, you know, for me, you know, my background, my PhD is in economics. I've been thinking about security and economics since 2002. This is absolutely where we need to focus on. And first, I see this as a chicken and egg problem, right? No one asks for this data, so no one supplies it. No one supplies it, so no one asks for it. The first thing to understand is that if you make software, as we were just talking about, this is something where you actually can't really do it well without having this information, right? You need to know, or rather, you can get far greater efficiencies if you have this internally. Then once you have it, being able to share this downstream is one of those lovely signals of a mature process that we're all talking about. How do I communicate that I've got an effective process? So for example, right now today, or at least even several years ago, a large chunk of a major American bank was already asking, hey, can you give me an SBOM? Now, they didn't have the ability to automatically process this information because, frankly, several years ago, there wasn't any widely used data format for this. But, so you could fax it to them. But if you couldn't give them an SBOM, their experience said your development process is going to be bad enough that we're going to take, we know that the quality of supporting your software, the cost of supporting your software is going to be higher. So we're going to take 5 to 10% off your asking price off the top today. And so that gets us to the notion that for a mature customer, this is going to be something that you absolutely need, right? If you need to be able to say, hey, let me demonstrate that this product does not have these vulnerabilities, or you can't have these vulnerabilities, this is going to be a very powerful tool. I think you're right, this is going to be something that isn't for everyone. For me, the analogies are pretty similar to threat intelligence, right? There are going to be lots of organizations that simply aren't in a position to use any threat intelligence. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be spending time and effort trying to think through how to make it better and more efficient. I think of this as the next step down from asset management from a blue team perspective. So if you don't know what software you're running, if you don't know what boxes you have, SBOM's really not for you. But once you have that, this is the obvious next step, is not only do I have this blinking box, but this blinking box is using this encryption library that is almost certainly vulnerable to this kind of attack.
So, couple weeks ago, we mentioned the Ripple 20 stuff. Many companies don't know what they have under the hood. Supply chain security is important. You've got third parties talking to third parties, talking to third parties, talking to third parties. Most of them are not in the United States once you get past, first or second rung out, because you're dealing with resellers, you're dealing with chipsets from companies that are, overseas, because that's just the way things happen. How does a company, technically in the United States, or, as I was doing research, I saw that healthcare is starting to require these as part of their medical device manufacturing. How do you get that second and third level down? How do you get them involved and make them want to give you that information without having to resort to things like lawyers or IP, court cases and such?
So there are a couple of different ways to do it. The easiest way is just contract, right? This is going to be the natural part of how people are going to start asking for software, especially, again, once we have sort of these globally accepted ways of doing it. As we, Brian mentioned open source. The challenge here, what we want to do, open source community is realizing, there's value in being able to demonstrate a certain amount of process maturity as we want to grow and get market share in our own little space. That's why you have the Linux Foundation badges. It's why the Oasis folks are thinking about open source governance, and this is going to be a natural part of that, of sort of starting to push this further up the supply chain. Again, won't solve everything. There's a lot of things we want to pay attention to in open source assurance and things like that. But SBOM is a very natural part, especially because that is literally transparent. All we need to do is try to make it in data that is a little easier to access and a lot easier to automate.
Okay. So let's say that I am a company and, listening to this podcast, and all of a sudden, I go in tomorrow to the Monday Zoom and go, we need to start making an SBOM. And, senior leadership's like, yes, we should go ahead and do that. How do you start?
That's an easy conversation.
Yeah, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, hopefully it's that easy, but it probably will never be. But I mean, so how do you make an SBOM? How do you add this to part of your process? Because what I'm hearing is that the difficulty, or the reason companies may not have this, is, like you said, maturity. But the other one is you have to change the process to incorporate this in. So if if you're not doing Agile, or you're doing Agile, or this is going to take additional process to want to put it into your testing and release and what have you. So where in development should you be starting to work on the BOM? And how do you make it? What kind of data formats would work? I mean, is it just JSON, or is there a specific guideline to it? And I give you an SBOM, and what does my company do with that if I don't know what to do with it?
So you're now zooming in on the core of what we're trying to do, which is first acknowledging that one of the reasons it's a sticky problem is this isn't just a technical issue, right? All of the purely technical things in security, we can just, in the before times, we could just say, all right, for the next year, once every 2 months, we're going to set a bunch of engineers, they're going to sit in a hotel conference room, we're going to pound this out, we're done. The hard security problems involve getting the organizational shifts, getting, dare I say it, a few of the lawyers involved, and actually understanding what this looks like, because again, this is something that really, to work well, means moving across organizations. So first is, where do you do it? And that's gonna depend on whether you, right, if you're just in the business of buying software, it's pretty straightforward. Start asking for it. And then you said, well, once you have it, what do you do with it? That's a big part of what we're trying to do today, is not just focus on these software producers, but the folks that are consuming this information. So how do we integrate this into my SIEM, into my asset management, my vulnerability management? And we've got a number of vendors from that space already involved. Now, we'd say, all right, I'm making software. Well, let's assume I've got software out in the field. What do I do? Well, There's a whole class of vendors called security composition analysis. This is a lot of what they do, is to say, well, what's under the hood here? Now, that business was initially driven by licensing requirements. And some of you know that software open source licenses are a big deal. And I think that's actually one of the reasons why we don't have this today, is so many of even the biggest and richest companies didn't have their open source licenses completely in order until very recently. And whereas today, I think that's a much better understood risk. It's something that risk officers understand. There are commercial off-the-shelf tools that can handle it for you. Every startup knows they're going to have to go through an open source audit before they exit. So we get that part. So where do we start? Well, again, some of this comes down to what's the vision? What is, because I've been dancing around, we still haven't spelled out, damn it, Allan, what is an SBOM? And here's where we get to the first decision that we have to make as a community, which is the folks that really are mature about thinking about software supply chain say, I want all the data. I want to know the passport of the person who committed this particular line of code, right? What were the flags that were used in the compiler for this build? And that's amazing information. I want that too. But I also know that we got to crawl before we can walk, before we can run. And so the basic SBOM at the moment is really just the dependency tree. My software's top level, just what does it include? And then what are its following on includes? So second question, once we have that vision, and then there's some further work that we've done about, okay, how do we got to make sure we've got our known unknowns, that when you give me the information, I know, in addition to what information you're giving me, I also have some way of knowing what you're not giving me. So, I'm including this library. I will explicitly acknowledge whether that library is the leaf in my dependency tree or whether we simply don't know. And then you, as my downstream partner, can either say, great, I'll spend some security testing money, if only there were companies that specialized in security testing, or you can come back and say, hey, I want to know what's in this. So that's fine. Now we have, let's go further down the technical stack. Say, all right, well, yeah, but Allan, what is an SBOM? What are the what data format is? We did not want to create a brand new data format for a number of reasons. First, government. For those of you who know anything about government or who have worked in large organizations know that you got to stay in your lane. The U.S. Department of Commerce contains NIST. They specialize in standards. I wasn't about to try to form my own standards development process. I know enough about standards to know that it's a very dangerous space. Don't want to get into it lightly. But moreover, if you're trying to create something that connects to so many different parts of the ecosystem, you want to build on what's already there. Or you don't want to create something brand new. So the good news is that at least one community came forward and said, we've got a data standard that, while it's not doing SBOMs immediately, can be used for SBOMs. The slightly bad news was that more than one community came forward. And in fact, there are 3 data standards out there today that can be used to convey SBOM data. And so our interest here is to make sure they're all as cross-compatible as possible. They each have their advantages, they each have their disadvantages. And for those playing along at home, it's SPDX, Software Package Data Exchange from the Linux Foundation, SWID, Software ID Tags, which is a standard, it's an ISO standard, and then the latest kid to the marketplace is Cyclone DX, which comes out of the OWASP community and has really grown a lot over the last year or two. And the vision here is to make sure that they're cross-compatible. And what we started to do is create a list of here are all the tools that are generating this stuff and that are consuming this stuff so that folks know where to look and where to get started.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is that you have, XKCD has a very famous comic about there being 14 standards, and they're like, yes, we're going to take this and unite the standards. And it's like, now we have 15 standards. So how do you keep that from becoming what you're trying to do?
There are always going to be people who say, you know what, the standards that are out there don't do what I want. Let's make a new one. and I'm not going to actively stop them because I don't have any authority to do that. What I can do is sort of say, well, let's, one, see what works today, right? If my goal is as broad adoption as possible. So if someone wants to create their own standard and can tell a story of how it's going to be adopted, hey, that's great, vaya con Dios. But what I would rather do is emphasize the modularity and the dockability of this idea. So you can take this and map it, if you have a sophisticated security process, to what's already out there in your world or whatever your project is. So for example, some of your listeners may be familiar with something called Graphios or Intoto, which are some pretty amazing projects that came out of NYU, but are now in the open source community, to really think about the overall process for modern software, right? How do we track each step of its development? That's phenomenal. I think the goals in these processes we're not going to see in something like the embedded world or the IT world for quite some time. So we want to make sure that the SBOM side is lightweight enough that we can see it everywhere, and then we can slot it in with all these more mature processes.
Have you seen any pushback, like heavy pushback from places that, you know, may not be open source, but just don't think it's anybody's business?
Sure, especially when, you know, we first kicked this off. I had, you know, we had our first public kickoff meeting. The work that we're doing is open, it's transparent, we use the term a multi-stakeholder process. And if you roll your eyes hearing it, I'm the guy who has to say it like many times a day. But it means that folks can show up and speak their mind. And that, I think, gives our process a certain amount of legitimacy. But we had folks from even inside the same company. I had the director of product security from one big tech company show up and say, all right, we want this, we need this, we're seeing, you know, the majority of the bugs we're fixing used to be from our internal developers, now they're from our open source stuff that we're using, so we need to have better eyes into our open source ecosystem. That's great. And then his lobbyist stood up and said, this is a terrible idea. And, you know, I get it. It's a big world. We got a lot of disagreement. There are some legitimate concerns about this. One of them, we are going to see folks that say, hey, listen, we don't want to share this publicly. And that's fine. We want to, you know, make sure that there are ways that this can still end up in the hands of the customers, because you can't defend what you don't know about. And especially for on-prem and you know, the embedded side of things, we need to make sure that, you know, if I'm running some software on my network, I need to know what it is. And we're working through a bunch of different ways to sort of make sure that we can separate, for example, the way that I announce, here's where my SBOM is, and access control. So, you know, my device can say, you know, my very expensive network switch can say, hey, my SBOM is located at this URL. But that's separate from, well, who actually can read from that, and what credentials do I need to access it?
Right on. So what would, I'm trying to figure out why they wouldn't want to disclose it. I mean, there might be some IP issues, you know, some of the source might be closed. One of the other things I was thinking of was potentially they have technology that might be from a company that's on a restricted list. Would that be something like that? Like, oh, we've got Huawei chips or something in there?
Yeah, or maybe if they know how bad it is.
Which gets to the incentive piece that we were talking about earlier, which is it's a way, transparency is a way of allowing an organization to say, listen, I only use the freshest ingredients. But let's pull on that ingredient list, for example. You know, there are times when you go and buy your packet of cookies and it says, we are made with the finest ingredients in bold print. And then the list of ingredients, it says butter, sugar, flour, and natural flavors. And so if you want to say, hey, we use packages A, B, C, and D, and then we're also using a few things that we don't want to tell you about. I still think that gets us so far down the road, because now we've changed whose responsibility it is to do the full awareness and calculation of it. Because if you tell me, I'm not going to tell you whether or not there are any allergens in this packet of cookies, I can say, well, I'm going to go get a different packet of cookies for my family. And similarly, this analogy of making the known unknowns explicit gets us a little closer to better risk management.
One of the other things that you had mentioned in your B-Sides talk was the difference between software and firmware, and you said you didn't want to debate that, and I completely understand that. Firmware is kind of a hot mess, and it complicates the issue. Am I right in thinking that?
It does. The first approximation I like to go with is, did you write it? If you wrote it, not under the scope of SBOM. If you're using someone else's code, then that still gets us to the risks that we've been talking about. What are the ecosystem risks of having something that's used a lot of places that I need to worry about because maybe someone's going to write a mass scanning tool for it instead of just targeting my stuff.
Right.
And so while that doesn't solve everything, that gets us to most of the way there.
That was our show for this week. You can find show notes for this and all of our shows at www.breakingsecurity.com. You can also find an RSS link on the site to add to your favorite podcatcher. You can find all of us on Twitter. Miss Berlin can be found at InfoSyster, INFOSYSTIR. Mr. Betcher can be found at BetcherPwned, BOETTCHERPWNED. And you can follow me on Twitter at Brian Brake, BRYANBRAKE. We have a Slack. Come join us on our Slack. A lot of great things going on there, a lot of channels of various InfoSec-related subjects. You can get an invite on Twitter by emailing our official Twitter handle for the show at Brakesec, BRAKESEC, or you can email us at bds.podcast@gmail.com. Thank you to all of our Patreon supporters for their monetary assistance by offsetting costs involved in putting out a weekly show. Zoom fees, Libsyn hosting, domain purchase, renewal, equipment upgrades, time and effort building the community we have. We appreciate all of your help and support. If you'd like a t-shirt, stickers, coffee mug, or just to show your support for the show, you can check out our TPub site, www.tpublic.com/user/BDS podcast. We thrive on your feedback. A quick 5-star comment on iTunes or Google Play Store or your favorite streaming service, Spotify, Pandora, what have you, go a long way to gaining us additional visibility. It takes no time at all, and we appreciate your help in spreading the word. That was it for Breaking Down Security this week. Be safe, be well, be kind to one another. Take care of yourself because you're the only you have, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Hey everyone, Rachel Toback here, Chair of the Board for Women in Security and Privacy, also known as WISP. And I want to tell you about an opportunity to get involved in the community. On Friday, June 26th, the security community came together to lift and amplify the stories and work of Black security and privacy practitioners on Twitter and LinkedIn through the hashtag #ShareTheMicInCyber campaign, which was organized by Camille Stewart and Lauren Zabarick. In response to this campaign, we started raising funds for Najla, who is my partner in the campaign, also known as 4Psy_Q on Twitter, to sit for the PMP, OSCP, and CISSP. We ended up raising the $2,000 to cover Najla's expenses, and we're now moving on to cover as many training, certification, and learning or advancement expenses as possible, incurred by Black security and privacy practitioners in the Share the Mic and Cyber group. As of right now, on July 6th, we have $16,000 raised and about $26,000 in needs for the community. Please consider a donation or a corporate sponsorship to cover these expenses. You can head on over to tinyurl.com/sharewisp for our donation page, or you can go on our Twitter page @WispOrg so you can see the full donation link yourself. You're security-minded, probably want to see the full URL. I get it. Thanks so much for taking action, and I'll see you on the internet.